Everyone turn around and wave at the camera. And hello to everyone who's streaming us online around the world. And I don't know if it's like, does the internet work the same? I guess probably not with radio waves where it sort of goes out into the universe and someone in a planet orbiting Vega will see this someday. It is wonderful to have everybody here. If you are new at All Saints or visiting us this morning and would like to know what else is going on, and there's a huge amount going on in this community, we have green contact sheets near both doors. Please take us a moment to give us your contact information. There's also a welcome table on the lawn where you can pick up a red welcome bag that includes a welcome card to fill out in return or fill out there, and just lots of other great information about All Saints Church. At all times, we put our faith into action here at All Saints, and every week we focus it towards one action that we can take as a community. And this week we're celebrating Earth Day by writing to the Pasadena mayor and city council and asking them to support a goal of achieving 100% carbon-free electricity in Pasadena by 2035 as part of the city's climate action plan. So we're asking everyone to sign on to a letter to the mayor of Pasadena. And if you're a resident of Pasadena, we also ask that you sign a letter to your member of city council. And you can do that by stopping by the action table this morning. And then we also ask that you continue to give to support the ministries of All Saints Church. And you do that with your pledges and you do that with your other gifts. If you're streaming online, there's a donate button that you can click on and give to support the work of All Saints Church, not just only in our own community, but the work that we do in Pasadena and really across the nation and beyond. So thank you for your support for that. God dwells in you. Let us pray. Holy and loving God, giver of all good gifts, we thank you this morning for the gift of creativity. We thank you for the gift of love. We thank you for the way that love challenges us and surprises us and changes us. We thank you for the way that love makes us new in ways that sometimes do not make us comfortable. We thank you for the opportunity to have conversations like this about love and how it has been expressed throughout the ages and how it has been wrestled with. Ask you to be present in these conversations. Ask you to awaken love in our own hearts and give us the courage to express it and live it with each other. Amen. Today is really, really fun for me, and I think it's going to be fun for all of us. First of all, we've got really just an extraordinary person as a forum speaker. Mark Beauregard is an author. He was a finalist for the First Fiction Award at the Los Angeles Times Book Award for his book, The Whale, A Love Story, and copies are available over there, and I encourage you not to leave without picking one up. This is an extraordinary, well-researched and well-written book of historical fiction. It's also just an incredibly moving story. It was one of those books that I just couldn't put down, and it is. I'm going to let Mark let you talk more about it, but it is about the relationship between Herman Melville and Nathaniel Hawthorne as Melville was editing Moby Dick. But it's especially fun for me because Mark and I have been friends since our freshman year of high school. And known each other for a long time, and it has been fantastic getting reacquainted.
If you'd like to know some stories about Mike, you can see me afterwards.
Maybe I should just leave and you all can just talk. So it is just, I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm going to turn it over to Mark, but please welcome Mark Beauregard.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks for that beautiful introduction. So I just want to take a quick poll. Most of us get Moby Dick and Scarlet Letter as the basic works of American literature in school. How many have read Moby Dick? Scarlet Letter? Yeah. How many of you knew that Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville were friends? How many of you knew that they were in a romantic relationship together? Okay, this will be fun. Well, what I'd like to do is first of all, I'm really honored and delighted to have this opportunity to talk to you because one of the ways that Melville and Hawthorne connected was through their spiritual quest. They each had deeply religious feelings and deeply religious backgrounds, but they tried to find God in incredibly different ways. But they were both doing so in ways that were out of step with their communities and their times. And that's one of the ways that they connected. So I'm hoping that we'll have a chance to talk a little bit more about that as the forum goes along. But I'd just like to start by talking about the way I discovered their relationship and what the nature of their relationship was and why it matters. So I was working on a book that was going to be very bad about Oliver Wendell Holmes. It was actually the only idea I had, so I was pursuing it. And Oliver Wendell Holmes was a neighbor of Melville's and Hawthorne's, and there was a burgeoning literary community in America at the time, largely concentrated in New York, but also in the Berkshires of Western Massachusetts. And writers would go to the Berkshires for the same reason that writers go to the Berkshires now. They were escaping New York and Boston, the hubbub of the city. And so I was researching this book by Oliver Wendell Holmes, but they were writing letters to one another constantly. It was really a small group of people who were making up American literature on the fly. And they all knew each other, and they competed against each other, and they supported one another. So as I was researching this book about Oliver Wendell Holmes, I was reading Hawthorne's and Melville's letters as well, and the letters of their family and friends, and just as background for Holmes. And I came across some extraordinary letters from Melville to Hawthorne. And actually, I'm going to read some excerpts from a couple of the letters. Again, I thought, well, this is very odd. And I want to say this, the first letter I'm going to read is from November of 1851, and Melville uses the word in writing to Hawthorne. He uses the word magians, and most people, it's an old-fashioned term for magician, but it's also a Zoroastrian term for prophet. And it gives you an idea of the kind of ease that Melville had speaking in religious language to Hawthorne, because not many of their contemporaries would have a context for Magian, but Hawthorne and Melville studied Zoroastrian and Manichaean texts, and it was one of the ways, this sort of shorthand, not short of hand, but sleight of hand, shorthand. It was a way that they developed an idiom of their own, a shorthand where they spoke in religious language. So here's without further ado, here's a letter that Melville wrote to Hawthorne in November of 1851. If the world was entirely made up of Magians, I'll tell you what I should do. I should have a paper mill established at one end of the house, and so have an endless ribbon of foolscap rolling in upon my desk. And upon that endless ribbon, I should write 1,000, 1,000,000, 1,000,000,000 thoughts, all under the form of a letter to you. The divine magnet is on you, and my magnet responds. Which is the biggest? A foolish question. They are one. And a little later in the same letter, he says, Whence come you, Hawthorne? By what right do you drink from my flagon of life? And when I put it to my lips, lo, they are your lips and not mine. And in another letter inviting Hawthorne to come over and stay for a few days, Melville says, You may do what you please, say or say not what you please, and if you feel any inclination for that sort of thing, you may spend the period of your visit in bed if you like, every hour of your visit in bed. And he's underlined the words in bed. And I should tell you that Melville was living in a house with 4 sisters, his wife, his mother, and an infant son, and they only had 3 bedrooms, and Melville had an office, and off to the side of his office was a rather large closet that he kept a single bed in for Hawthorne, and no one was allowed to sleep in it but Hawthorne. So these are kind of curious things. Well, so she said it's subtle. But actually, the standard of affectionate expression in the 19th century for men and women who were heterosexual was really different from the one that we have today. So today, if you walk hand in hand with, so I'm a man, and Mike and I often walk hand in hand together, and people look at us odd. But we're just friends, right? So in the 19th century, heterosexual male friends and female friends could just walk around holding each other and hugging each other, and they would write things like, "You have my heart forever, and I love you forever," and it was just taken as a sign of friendly affection. But even at that standard, people weren't saying, when you drink from my flagon of life. And there's just a tremendous amount of sexual metaphor in the letters from Melville to Hawthorne. So I thought, well, what did Hawthorne have to say? And so I went to look for Hawthorne's letters. It turns out that Melville burned Hawthorne's letters at Hawthorne's request. So why would you ask someone to burn your letters? There are a few reasons. One of them might be that you're in love with them and married to a woman. This has led me on a 6-year odyssey of digging into their archives, reading the journals of their family and friends. I was lucky that they were all writing all the time. There are some towns in the Berkshires that had mail delivery twice a day. I mean, now with email delivery, we have mail delivery 40,000 times a day, but it's not quite the same. The kind of meditation and contemplation that you find in these letters and the personal insights, the revelations that you find is really extraordinary. And by researching these letters, I discovered that everybody around Hawthorne and Melville noticed that something odd was going on. So what was going on? So let me give you the framework of their relationship. So we know them as these kind of wizened graybeards who came down from on high and delivered American literature to us. But at the time when they met in 1850, they were guys just trying to figure out how to survive and how to write books. They met at a picnic arranged by Oliver Wendell Holmes in 1850 in the Berkshires. And at the time, Hawthorne had just come off of writing Scarlet Letter, so he was kind of a big celebrity. And the only reason he was in the Berkshires was because he was being hassled so much in Salem, because everyone was kind of up in arms about how, the adulterous romance and how irreverent and impossible it was to talk about Scarlet Letter. By the way, preachers were condemning Scarlet Letter from their pulpits, so it was selling like crazy. So Hawthorne's 46. He's in the Berkshires to escape. Melville is, and he's beautiful, by the way. There is no letter that you can find from someone at the time who meets Hawthorne for the first time that doesn't describe his beauty. He has this wavy chestnut hair and these penetrating brown eyes, and there are a few portraits of him that are, you understand why someone would be mesmerized by this. And not only is he smart and he's a good writer, but he's just beautiful. Melville's beautiful too in a very different way. He's barrel-chested. He's 31 years old, so he's 15 years younger than Hawthorne at the time. And his fortunes are not quite doing so well as Hawthorne's. So Hawthorne has this first big success. Melville has 5 novels out, each one critically and commercially doing worse than the one before. He has 2 incredible bestsellers in 1845 and 46 with Typee and Umu, which are they're kind of very thinly veiled autobiographical novels about his time in the South Pacific on a whaling vessel. And by the way, he just uses them constantly to poke fun at the missionaries and to lampoon and burlesque the priests who are trying to convert the so-called heathen in the South Pacific, which is another way that Hawthorne and Melville connected. Hawthorne reviewed Typee when it came out in 1845 and noted that it was a bit blasphemous, but very entertaining. So when they meet, they're 15 years different, and they're both married, they both have children, and they weren't really looking around for anything other than companionship, but when they met at this picnic, it was electric and immediate, and they both felt it. And I'll tell you, and we have evidence for that, and I'll give you a little bit of evidence in a minute, but my book opens with their meeting at the picnic, and I'd like to read just a little bit of it for you. There's a lot of conversation about cheese in this passage. And since you've read Moby Dick, you know that Melville spends a lot of time talking about the quotidian features of whaling vessels. He describes everything from the rope to the barrel staves. There's no object that goes on a whaler that's not left undescribed in sometimes painful detail. And he spends a great deal of time on how the Dutch pack cheese into their vessels. And so there's a lot of stuff in my book that just sort of riffing on Moby Dick and on the things that Melville was concerned with. And this is another way that Melville and Hawthorne connected, because Hawthorne is always looking for allegories of the eternal in the everyday. And in his writing, you're always about 2 sentences away from something eternal. No matter how banal the thing he seems to be talking about, he's about to make some connection to God. And Melville is the same way, although a bit more rambunctious. So when they talked and when they recorded their conversations, it was often these sort of, cheeky, they would begin in a cheeky sort of way, and then it would immediately turn into something much more profound. And so there's one other character in this scene besides Hawthorne and Melville. It's J.T. Fields, who was a literary lawyer, and he was one of the people at the picnic. Fields opened a bottle of champagne and passed it around, and the picnic began in earnest. This is all preface. The actual picnic, they were just going to take a hike up Monument Mountain, but a tremendous rainstorm broke out, and they had to take cover underneath a rock out, sort of overhang. So I'm just going to read it. Fields opened a bottle of champagne and passed it around, and the picnic began in earnest. The rain fell in giant drops around them and ran off the edges of the overhang in sheets. They practically had to shout to hear one another over the torrent, and as they passed around bread and salami and cheeses and peaches and smoked beaver and brandy and more champagne, yes, they did have smoked beaver, they found themselves congregating naturally into little islands of 2 and 3, the most easily to hear one another's conversation. Herman stayed close to Hawthorne. When Fields went to search the picnic baskets for a tin of caviar, Herman found himself alone with the mesmeric figure on the fringes of the party, just at the edge of the outcropping, where the splashing of water made their speech unintelligible to the others. He leaned toward Hawthorne, wishing urgently to communicate something of the sorceries that had bewitched him at the moment of their meeting. But he could find no words for his feelings. In fact, he imagined that no human language could ever express what he now felt, since it seemed inspired not only by Hawthorne in his person, but also by some mystical new alignment in the heavens. Hawthorne seemed the living expression of an idea so well formulated in Herman's own mind that his only response could be, yes, true, what an elegant solution. "This cheddar is excellent," said Hawthorne. He sliced a bite from the hunk in his hand and gave the cheese and knife to Herman, who held them out in front of himself as if they were a shield and sword. Hawthorne stared out at the downpour. "I have been thinking all day," Herman finally said, "about the correspondence between the physical expression of a thing and the truth of the thing, and how one might infer the truth from the expression." "You mean the platonic form of a thing?" Hawthorne said. "Anything? Like that cheese you're holding, for instance?" Hawthorne was 15 years Herman's senior, but his face seemed to Herman to defy the laws of earthly decay. So noble did Hawthorne seem that Herman conjectured that some unique mechanism had gradually been transferring his inner beauty, touch by touch, outward toward his external features with each passing day, so that even long into the future, when Hawthorne would be much advanced in years, his inward nobility would compensate so fully for his outward decrepitude that his face would become almost ethereal. "Yes," said Herman, "like this cheese. But even more than that, I've been considering the possibility that the facts that can be ascertained about this cheese fail to satisfy, because they facts themselves mask a metaphysical truth that can only be known through the transcendent poetic expression of the cheddar. That is, though the world itself can never truly be known, one might begin to know some truth about the world through a metaphysical cheese." And they go on to talk a great deal about cheese and ultimately make a kind of communion out of the cheese and wine. So I mentioned earlier that this was a sort of divine spark that went between them. Well, how do we know that? Immediately after this picnic, Hawthorne invited Melville to spend a few days at his house. But why is that so unusual? Well, Hawthorne never invited anybody to his house. He had 2 children at this time, 7 years old and 5 years old, and some of his best friends had never even seen them. He had college friends that he only corresponded with, that he would never invite to his house and would never go to his house. He was a recluse. So for him to invite Melville to come over for a few days was really something, and everyone noted how odd it was. And Melville was much more direct in his feelings. A couple of days after their meeting, he wrote a review of Hawthorne's short story collection, Mosses from an Old Manse, in a magazine called The Literary World. This is unusual for a couple of reasons. One, Mosses from an Old Manse had been out for 5 years, and no one wanted a review of it. It wasn't selling. No one actually cared anymore about this book. The Scarlet Letter was the thing everyone cared about. And the other thing is, the language in the review is unmistakably erotic. And in fact, there's a Hawthorne scholar called David Kesterton who says that this is a love letter in the form of a review, and I'd just like to read a couple of passages from that. "I've just returned from the haymow," Melville writes, "charged more and more with love and admiration of Hawthorne. I feel that this Hawthorne has dropped germinous seeds into my soul. He expands and deepens down the more I contemplate him, and further he shoots his strong New England roots into the hot soil of my southern soul. So I don't know how far south you keep your souls. Melville was so taken with Hawthorne that he bought a house in the Berkshires so that he could be near him. And this is even more extraordinary when you know that he's essentially bankrupt at this point and has to secretly borrow thousands of dollars that he can't possibly pay back from a family friend in order to afford this house. He's desperate for love, he's desperate for money, he's desperate for a hit. When he meets Hawthorne, he has a version of Moby Dick. And when he moves into the Berkshires, he thinks, well, I'll sell the version of Moby Dick I have, and I'll pay for the house, and Hawthorne and I will take long walks through the woods, and everything will be fine. The version of Moby Dick he has is like Taipi and Umu. So these burlesques, these lampoons, it's very light. He thinks, well, the people want that, I'm going to write that. So he was really just trying to write a bestseller. But he shows it to Hawthorne, and Hawthorne says, you may have something here. Don't sell yourself short. And he starts giving him Shakespeare's tragedies to read, and romantic poets, and he starts reading King Lear. And under Hawthorne's tutelage, he starts to transform Moby Dick into something much more broad and allegorical in the same way that Hawthorne was writing. And in fact, there's a way in which he's trying to out-Hawthorne Hawthorne, or to prove to Hawthorne how much Hawthorne means to him by outdoing Hawthorne, or writing in his style. And Mike said in the beginning, the book is dedicated to Hawthorne, but there are traces of Hawthorne all through the book, and little turns of phrase. There's a great scene. There's on one of the boats lower, and the whalers go out in their little boats and they harpoon a whale, and during the battle that ensues, the whale smashes one of their boats to bits. And Melville describes it, there's a whirlpool, and the smashed, but the wood from the boat is and the sailors are all flailing, and he describes it as like bits of nutmeg swirling in a punch bowl. And that is so characteristically Hawthorne. So there are traces of Hawthorne throughout this book. How much time do we have? Am I running long?
No, you're doing great.
Okay. In that case, I'll digress for a moment and say that whaling seems like a really exotic thing to be writing about now, but it was very, very common and a normal part of life in the 1850s. It was the 5th largest industry. It was sort of like the automobile industry. Young men often got their first jobs on whaling ships. That's how Melville got his first job. There was a depression, an economic depression in 1839, and he couldn't find work anywhere, so he shipped out on a whaler. Every house had whale tallow candles or whale oil lamps, whalebone corsets, sorry ladies, little figurines, tools made out of whalebone. It was a tremendously large industry. And actually, some of the biggest stores and concerns that we have today are survivals from the whaling industry. Macy's department store began as a supplier of whaleboats. Folgers Crystals, the coffee. Folgers, and those are very, Macy and Folger are very old Quaker names. Folgers was a way of getting, so whaling voyages would be 3 years long, and they needed a way to carry things either dried or compacted, and dried coffee was a way of having coffee, which is a real luxury out on the whaleboats. So it was not that unusual to think about whaling or to write about whaling, but it was very unusual to write about it in the way that Melville was writing about it. Not only did he drink the Hawthorne Kool-Aid, like he was really under the influence, he was trying to write an allegory like Hawthorne, but he was also allowing himself to express his erotic feelings for Hawthorne in the book. There's the first same-sex marriage in American literature in Moby Dick. If you haven't read it recently, just go to Romans and pick up a copy and turn to chapter 10. how people miss this at the time. I mean, he kind of plays it for laughs. He's like, look at these pagan people. It's Ishmael and Queequeg get married. And he's like, look, this is all just pagan and ha-ha, and Christians would never do this. But they actually get married, and they spend the night together, and he describes them in a very thinly veiled scene having sex. It's their wedding night. So that was, again, you have to have eyes to see. And the surrounding society, not only was same-sex love illegal and forbidden, but you could be punished by death if you expressed it openly. So the readers just were not prepared to see what was going on here. So he was kind of openly writing homoerotic stuff, and it was kind of flying by the censors, because how could he possibly be writing something like this? This is a description of how you process sperm fat, whale fat, into sperm oil. Squeeze, 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 all the morning long. I squeezed that sperm till I myself almost melted into it. I squeezed that sperm till a strange sort of insanity came over me, and I found myself unwittingly squeezing my co-laborers' hands in it, mistaking their hands for the gentle globules. Such an abounding, affectionate, friendly, loving feeling did this avocation beget, that at last I was continually squeezing their hands and looking up into their eyes sentimentally, as much as to say, oh, my dear fellow beings, why should we longer cherish any social acerbities? Why should we know the slightest ill humor or envy? Come, let us squeeze hands all around. Nay, let us all squeeze ourselves into each other. And I don't know when last time, like if you're at an office party and somebody turns to you and says, let us squeeze ourselves into each other. It's not hard to know what they mean. So Melville was coming at Hawthorne. They met all through the fall. Their conversations were incredibly intense. They wrote letters that were incredibly intense. And Hawthorne was like, whoa, easy. I got a wife, I've got kids, and oh, by the way, did you read my last book? It's about adultery. And not only was he devout and had a very puritanical idea of what it was to be a Christian, but he couldn't be seen having an affair. He didn't want to have an affair, and not only that, but it would completely ruin his family, and it would ruin his literary reputation. And he wasn't entirely sure how he felt about Melville to begin with. So there are long passages where long passages of time where Melville and Hawthorne come together and then break apart. And Hawthorne, we know that Hawthorne has a great deal of affection for Melville because he says so in his letters to other people, and he says so in his journals. But the intensity that Melville was kind of dreaming. It was as if he just like wanted to run off to the village and get an apartment and see what happened. And it just wasn't possible even to imagine that for Hawthorne, and it wouldn't have been possible to do it in any event. So there are many times when Hawthorne backs away and not only refuses to see Melville, but refuses to return his letters. And it's during these times when the writing of Moby Dick becomes incredibly impassioned, and when the object, the white whale, transforms into the object of impossible longing that we all know it as. And all the interpretations that we know, the people against nature, the longing for immortality, the absence of God, or the indifference of God, all those things that we've interpreted Moby Dick as, the whale as, I think are legitimate. But one of the things we haven't talked about is what Melville wanted in his personal life when he was writing it that was impossible. So this is another short passage from near the end of the book, during one of these periods of silence where Hawthorne won't return Melville's letters. Hawthorne's maddening silence continued all the way through the winter solstice, which brought the first real snowstorm of the season. It started when the lightest wisp of a snowflake fell against the window of Herman's study, and he traced its watery expiration down the pane with his finger. Here, he thought, is the mystery of all life and the transformations of water, the vast roaring swells of the ocean descending drop by drop and moment by moment as vapors, floating like angels into clouds, gliding far away from the mothering sea, floating inland over the solid earth, and then fluttering in crystalline loneliness down from the heavens. More and more snowflakes fell, lonely souls blown by the fates and the winter winds, each separate and unique, each falling blindly, hoping against hope to land in the original ocean of love, and finding instead only more lonely souls collecting on the dry ground. The snow transformed the landscape, at first pleasantly erasing the grass and the dirt and the sharp edges and corners of the house and barn. But then, as the flakes became heavier and bigger and fell faster and faster, the air itself turned white, a blank wall against which Herman's longing was just another ghost. Peering out on the blizzard, on the mantle of new snow collecting rapidly through the afternoon, he imagined that the whole earth was being swallowed by the all-consuming albino whale in his mind, that it had breached the pages of his book and devoured the landscape. At last, he thought, he knew how Jonah had felt. But as desolate as the landscape seemed, Herman still saw that the whiteness paradoxically enhanced the beauty of every object it touched. The rotting roof of the lean-to over the woodpile, now hidden by an unbroken plaster of snow. The newly statuesque solemnity of the old outhouse, redeemed into politeness by its alabaster coat. And the spindly bare branches of maple trees, rising like the marbled fingers of Bernini sculptures from the blank white pedestal of the earth below. This is how beauty must be, he thought, not pretty and safe, but unbearable and blank and fierce with the horror of isolation. The sudden winter death of the world mercifully made Hawthorne's silence tolerable, for the whole earth now became silent with an icy calm. Herman opened his study window to let the freezing air in, to numb his body, if not his mind, to the emptiness of Hawthorne's absence. And as his fingers turned stiff and red, he thought, I'm freezing inside, and my heart will harden into an icicle of longing. But oh, Nathaniel, you could thaw me with a word. So that's what Melville was doing. What was Hawthorne doing? Well, he's over in his little cottage in Lennox having the most productive period of his career. Normally, it would take him months and months to write a short story of a few pages. During this time, during his association with Melville, he wrote a new edition of Twice Told Tales, which was an old short story collection, The House of the Seven Gables, a really successful novel, The Wonder Book for Boys and Girls, which is a translation of old Greek and Roman myth into New England scenery for New England children, The Snow Image, a new collection of short stories, The Blithedale Romance, a new novel which in part is about his romance with Melville, and a campaign biography called The Life of Franklin Pierce, which helped his old friend Franklin Pierce get elected president. This is in a year and a half. It's the most, as I said, it's the most productive period in his career to date. It would be the most productive period in his career in his life. So it's interesting to me, there's no real evidence there, but it's interesting to me that when Melville was in love with him and writing him long impassioned love letters, and when he was taking long walks by lakes with Melville, he found a new creativity and a new burst of energy. And I don't think those things are coincidental. So eventually Hawthorne did relent and wrote Melville back, and they met again. And in November of 1851, Moby Dick was published. And Melville gave Hawthorne the very first copy of Moby Dick. It was dedicated to Hawthorne, and Hawthorne went home and read it immediately and wrote an incredibly flattering review and then moved away. He took his family to Concord, and essentially that was the end of their relationship. The love letter that is Moby Dick was too much to bear, and there was no way for Hawthorne to continue their relationship. And they saw each other only twice more in their lives. To add insult to injury, Melville is now sitting in a house in the Berkshires that he can't afford to be with a guy who's no longer there, and Moby Dick is a critical and commercial failure. When it came out, it sold 546 copies. The critics hated it. Everyone hated it. There were a few positive or mediocre reviews, but the vast majority of people thought he had gone off the bend. And it is a very strange book. It's a kitchen sink of a book. It anticipates literary techniques that wouldn't happen for another 70 years in the mainstream. But Melville really doesn't have anything else to do but to keep writing. So his next book, as a reaction, is called Pierre. And it's not only a commercial failure, but people said he was insane. There were newspaper articles that said he was insane and that people should keep the pen away from him and that he should never write again. So he really started to spiral into bankruptcy after Moby Dick and into despair, and he started drinking a lot, and his family life deteriorated. Hawthorne, because his friend Franklin Pierce became president, got an appointment to be the consul at Liverpool, and he left the country. Basically, that was the end of their relationship. They saw each other once more, but it was very tense, and they couldn't recapture their old familiarity. Hawthorne died in 1864, and he had returned to the United States, and he died on a trip with Franklin Pierce. And Melville couldn't bring himself to attend the funeral, but he did write this poem. Sorry, I've done this often enough that I think I'm not going to tear up when I read this, but I probably will. To have known him, to have loved him after aloneness long, and then to be estranged in life and neither in the wrong. And now for death to set his seal, ease me, a little ease, my song. By wintry hills his hermit mound the sheeted snowdrifts drape, and houseless there the snowbird flits beneath the fir trees' crape. Glazed now with ice the cloistral vine that hid the shyest grape. So lucky for us, Melville was able to channel all of his passion into a work that endures and that still offers us new insights today. So while their love and the expression of their love in real life was tragic, we still have a record of it. And there's part of me that feels like Melville would be, if not happy, at least somewhat pleased that the monument to his great love survives. Thank you.
We have time for one or two questions. Are there one or two people with questions? Jason? Oh, you're taking it to someone. We have time for one or two questions. We have.
You didn't have the letters of Hawthorne that had been burned, I think you indicated. So what are your sources for how Hawthorne responded? And how much of it is your own kind of interpretation and judgment? How much of it comes from other sources? Now, some of it obviously comes from Melville's own letters, I assume.
So some of it, in the book, in my book are all of Melville's letters. 7 remain, and they're all reprinted in the book. And I've created Hawthorne's letters. And I did so using his journals and using the letters that he wrote to other people about Melville. Hawthorne expressed deep affection for Melville in his own writing and his own letters. But the alluring thing, I mean, this is why this relationship is going to remain a great mystery, is his letters have disappeared. So I tried to infer what he might have said based on the letters that Melville wrote in return. And I really want to honor these two men. It took me a couple of years of research just to be convinced that this was really what, despite the seeming clarity of Melville's feelings, I didn't want to read back into it something that was a 21st century interpretation. So I had to convince myself that it was real, and in doing so, I wanted to create the letters that would honor them. So I've done it. I've tried to be as historically accurate as possible, but I did just make them up. So I'm not. This is my. I think this is right. I believe in this idea of it. I'm not saying it's necessarily true. Hawthorne held Melville in great esteem, and I've tried to capture that esteem in the humor that they express toward each other in their journals.
I wanted to ask how difficult it was to get access to the letters that you did get access to, and then secondly, are you the first to discover this, and how has the relationship gone unproclaimed in any event until now?
It was pretty easy to get access to the letters. Scholars have been looking at these materials for decades, so people are used in the archives that house these letters. People are used to getting requests for them. And academics have been doing work about the relationship, the literary relationship, and the so-called friendship between Hawthorne and Melville for years. And there's a community in the there's a subgroup of the Melville community that thinks it's no surprise that they were amorously involved. People resist it because they're sort of invested in the current interpretations of Melville and Hawthorne. But I had this vetted with a bunch of Melville professors, and to make sure that it was historically accurate at least. And I'm doing interpretation, but the history is accurate, and people have conjectured that this could be true. My new idea is that Hawthorne is the whale, is that we've been missing the meaning of this giant symbol this whole time. So all the other stuff about the relationship, it's been combed over pretty well, and people have looked at it before, but this was a new this interpretation of Moby Dick is a new interpretation, which is probably the only idea I'm going to have in my life. So I hope it's right.
I want to thank you for bringing not only a introduction of the personal relationships and what impact they had, but also the cross-pollination of the writing styles and insights that produce some of the great literature we have. So that's really a very fresh and interesting viewpoint. And wanted to know if there was any influence the other direction on writing styles for Hawthorne.
Not much in terms of style. Actually, the only thing I can detect is just is Hawthorne's productivity. Melville was writing like mad at all times, and Hawthorne, I think, kind of rose to the occasion in that way. But I can't make a PhD dissertation out of it. It just seems interesting to me that down the street, Melville is churning out 800-page novels, and suddenly Hawthorne can find the strength to do the same.
Thanks very much. I want to just connect, if you would be so brave to consider whether the whale oil and the whale killing and the industry of whale oil on this Earth Day weekend is of any consequence at all in the analysis that Hawthorne and Melville were into. Because here we have this great love for, what shall we say, energy, this great energy of the whale. And then the sense of death, both of which are sexual images, to be sure, but are they not also greater images of our love for something which could be deadly? I wonder if you're willing to step into that a little today, because I lived in the shadow, I think it's called Arrowhead, where the infamous house where Melville lived, and prowled around Concord where Hawthorne lived. And I appreciate the richness of your interpretation in the homoerotic and sexual dimensions, surely. But maybe it's also into the energy realm.
Well, so a couple of things about that. The first thing is that Moby Dick is a God-obsessed book. So I think it's completely legitimate, and Melville would want us to interpret the whale as a simulacrum of God, or a symbol of a kind of allegory of the impossibility of actually touching the divine, and how dangerous it is to do so. The other thing is, in their actual, so just to widen the lens a little bit, Melville's book is the first kind of environmental book. It's the first book where he expresses any concern about species survival. So he asks, can the whale survive under this onslaught? And that it actually formed a cornerstone of the green movement that people started doing in the 60s and 70s. People started doing green interpretations of Moby Dick. So Melville is concerned with the survival of the whale and can we survive the loss of such a massive species? But a contrary thing is also happening. The slaughter of whales is feeding our westward expansion. Many of the whaling companies invested in railroads, and so a lot of the money there's a tremendous amount of money in whaling, and a lot of the money that came back went into financing our westward expansion, not only in building the railroads, but in lubricating the works. Whale oil is a tremendous lubricant. So there's a way in which Melville was looking at the whale as something that was of a planetary concern, but all of the energy that they were taking from it was being used. So the slaughter of the whale ended up being a kind of slaughter of the West as well. The conquest of the West was on the backs of the conquest of whales. And there's an interesting thing, so just one other thing about whale oil. Up until 1973, NASA used whale oil as lubricant for its space missions because it's incredibly viscous at incredibly low temperatures. And until 73, they didn't have a synthetic alternative. So, that one small step for a man, one giant leap for... He's actually riding on the back of whales to the moon.
We have time for one more, and then will you stay after to sign books?
I would love to if anybody
Yeah.
wants one.
First of all, thank you so much. Your presentation is captivating, and the subject matter is fascinating. I think it's part of that nonfiction narrative, which is so enticing.
Thank
I
you.
wanted to ask you, for any of the descendants of Nathaniel Hawthorne or Melville, are you aware of who they might be, or has there been any contact or interest in contacting just to see what their ideas might be concerning the subject?
Sure, yeah. I think Chris Hawthorne, doesn't Chris Hawthorne?
Yeah, we tried to get Chris Hawthorne to come here for the LA Times. He's a descendant, and yeah, we were unable to get him here, but yeah.
And Allison Hawthorne Deming, who's a very well-regarded poet and essayist, works in my hometown of Tucson. She recently, I'm not sure what she's doing now, but she used to be the head of the creative writing department there. And she had some papers of Hawthorne's that weren't available in other archives. I mean, to me, this is not something that I wanted to honor the families. It's not something I wanted to do to, change their, I didn't want to impose anything on them. So I did check with them. And I'll tell you a very brief story. I'm just looking at the clock. I did a thing at Harvard Bookstore when the book first came out. And so I did a reading, and there were quite a few people, and off to my left, there was an old guy with a broad face and sort of sun-beaten and his red cheeks and like a very Quaker kind of face. And he was sitting the entire time doing this, and he was sweating. And I thought, oh, there's trouble. Because not everybody likes thinking of the idea that Melville was in love with Hawthorne. So I finished my reading, and I asked for if there's any questions, and he raises his hand first time. And I call on him, and he gets up and stammers and sits down again. And he says, go to somebody else. So I go to somebody else, and he does it again. And this time, he kind of half stands, and he's sweating, and he's stammering, and he sits back down again. And it happens 3 times. And so at the very end, I was curious now, and I said, look, just please, sir, we're all friends here. Whatever you have to say, just please say it. It turns out he's the great-great-great-grandson of Melville, and he runs a harbor cruise out of Boston Harbor, a whale watching cruise. And essentially, he came out that day. He said that he'd been struggling with these same issues, and I was very flattered that he thanked me for writing the book because it helped him find expression for something that he had been struggling with in his own family for his whole life. And I can't imagine, I pinch myself sometimes, and so the validation that came with that review was really tremendous. And I wish I'd known about him before. I would have talked to him while I was writing the book. But both families have been very generous.
First of all, I think I need to apologize for not condemning your book from the pulpit and helping your sales.
Maybe at the 11:15 service.
That's right. Can we give Mark a hand? Thanks.